Hi there, I'm Lee Mottershead and this is the latest edition of The Front Page, during which it will become apparent that one thing does indeed lead to another. For a start, what about Horse Racing Ireland and some Irish trainers? They are very critical of the current ban on Irish horses in the lowest grades of British racing. They say the ban is stupid. They point to poor field sizes in British racing, and yet the most critical problem in relation to field sizes is actually in the sport's better races, which leads us in turn to the Racing League. It returned last week with a new look, but not with full field sizes, and once again facing criticism that it's actually exacerbating the sport's field size problem in non-racing league meetings. And that in turn leads us to triple champion jockey Silvestre De Sousa. He has decided to leave Britain and head to Hong Kong because he says he can't get enough rides on good horses in all these races that don't have enough runners. And that surely would lead you to think that British racing is a sport in crisis, and yet the urgency with which the sports leaders are tackling that crisis might well lead you to think otherwise. And with so many things leading to so many other things, we've got a bigger than usual panel this week. 4 people to talk about the big issues. 3 of us are here in London, where I'm joined by Racing Post editor Tom Kerr and my colleague Maddy Playle. You both well?
Yes, very well.
Good to be here.
Isn't it good to be here? And in Cheltenham, at his home, is James Stevens. Hello, James.
Hi, Lee. Yeah, here in Cheltenham. Not too long to go before it all kicks off here, but yeah, looking forward to discussing the week's big talking points.
So, Tom, you have got the overarching story, if you like, of this week, an industry in crisis and the leaders not doing enough to tackle it now.
That's right. Regular viewers of this show will know that there are several unfortunate recurring themes this season. Field sizes are at historic lows, prize money complaints are rife, attendances have fallen off a cliff, our talented horses are being shipped out to wealthier nations in record numbers, and many thousands of punters are already being hit by affordability checks. All in all, it makes for pretty grim reading for racing, and it's an unavoidable sense of a crisis brewing. Now, we've been reporting on all of these stories for months, and I think we've seen how the sport as a whole is sort of coming together in a rare display of unified view that something needs to be done and something needs to be done urgently. And we certainly saw that with the Savile plan, which gained widespread backing from different corners of the racing industry. But the sense that nothing is happening, or certainly nothing's happening very quickly, has become quite alarming. And to the degree that the other week, after we were reporting on the Savile plans and people were talking about, well, we need to get stuff in place for 2024, I wrote an editorial where I basically said, where is the urgency from racing's leaders? The crisis is unfolding now in 2022, and we need solutions for 2022, not for 2024. Now, this editorial clearly struck a chord with our readers and our professionals, and I think a lot of people have taken up the call for something to happen more urgently. But it also provoked a response from the chairman of the BHA, the Racecourse Association, and the Thoroughbred Group, which represents racing professionals. And they came back and they basically defended what they're doing, and they said, listen, we are taking action, and here's what we're doing. They talked about how they are dealing with British racing's governance structure, and they have to deal with that first. And that's a very fair point, because as we've discussed also in here many times, the governance structure is a car crash, it's a recipe paralysis, and we do need to deal with that. But there's no time frame for when that's going to be dealt with. We take it under trust that this is something we'll expect news on soon, but we've already been waiting months for an update on this. And then they talk about the industry strategy, and the industry strategy is the sort of the medium to long-term vision for where this sport is going to go. This was announced on June the 1st by the BHA. Over 2 months later, we basically know nothing more about this industry strategy. We don't know what time frame it's going to deliver in. We don't know what its terms of reference is. We don't know who's going to be contributing to it. And crucially, we don't know when any recommendations it makes will be put in place. We do know that the fixture list for 2023 is basically complete.
Yep.
It will be released within a few weeks. So, and the BHA and others have already ruled out any significant changes to the fixture list in 2023. So we're looking at 2024 before any of those sort of major changes can take place. Now, these leaders said, talking about the industry review, they said, creating a sustainable long-term strategy for British racing requires extensive stakeholder input and consultations before decisions take effect, which is not exactly words which convey an overwhelming sense of urgency. But of course, they do have a fair point there. This is a major issue. We don't want to rush into things. We don't want to make knee-jerk decisions. We don't want to make wrong decisions which might exacerbate the situation. But clearly, changes need to come soon. They need to come before 2024. They need to come, frankly, before 2023, because racing is suffering issues. And what really alarms me and alarms a lot of followers of the sport and a lot of people whose livelihoods depend on the sport is the prospect of a cycle of decline beginning. Basically, all those factors we talked about earlier are harming racing's income sources. So there's less money being bet in the sport, there's less money coming through in ticket sales, and that means there's less money available for prize money. Prize money means there will be fewer horses in training, more quality horses sold, which means there's lower field sizes, the sport is less appealing, and you see how it goes down. If we don't arrest that cycle, very soon, the concern is that the damage that is being dealt to the sport will be so considerable, it won't be recoverable. So this, to me, is the case for urgency. And not to disrespect what they're doing with the industry strategy, not to disrespect the very important questions around governance that are taking place, but I just question whether, extensive stakeholder input and consultation is the right answer for a crisis like what we are currently seeing in racing. I would suggest instead, what racing basically needs is something more comparable to what happened during COVID-19. The equivalent of an emergency budget, or a commission that is empowered to look at the issues facing racing and to deliver some answers. And we did, of course, have something similar to that for jumps racing. And Lee, you were actually involved in this group. Why don't you tell us, your experience there?
So I was involved in the Quality Jumps Racing Review Group, which set out to tackle issues that had become apparent at the penultimate Cheltenham Festival, where Irish trained horses completely dominated the meeting. Great for Ireland, not so great for British racing. But it also sought to look at other current problems with British jump racing, principally that winter period when we don't have enough competitive contests. We have lots of Grade 2 weight for age conditions races that get very small fields, don't attract interesting sort of betting fare, and just basically aren't serving the sports customers as they should do. So a group came together, a group of very well-meaning people that wanted to make change, that came right across the industry. And we produced a report that went to the BHA board that was passed through by the BHA board that suggested making a series of changes principally to the sports pattern, to the top end of races, to try and make those races more competitive. That was many months ago now, and still nothing has happened. Now, I don't for a second believe that is because the BHA's leaders have wanted nothing to happen, but it is reflective of the wider issues that you have said. You have to get agreement with so many people before things can happen. The races that need to be changed are not controlled by the BHA. They're not owned by the BHA. The majority of the sport's best jump races, for example, are owned by the Jockey Club. So you need the Jockey Club to agree to make changes before anything can happen. And the problem with this issue, and it's reflective of other issues too, is that delay seems to be the sport's go-to position when it faces a crisis.
So you were dealing with problems which arose or became apparent over the last couple of seasons.
Yeah.
Recommendations were in January.
Yep.
And in August, we're now talking about that work being subsumed in the industry strategy, which hasn't actually begun yet. It's not so much kicking the can down the road as strapping it to a rocket and firing it off into space. it's just not good enough, is it?
And the frustration is that with this particular story, this particular issue, there would have been at least a handful of changes that you could have implemented straight away. Even if it was just looking at 3 or 4 big races, which you think, well, if we move that from there to there, if we axe that, if we do this, that wouldn't have required radical reform, but would at least have started to do something so that people could see the sport was serious about making changes and wasn't planning to wait until 2027 to actually do something. So there's the frustration.
Yeah.
You can have a wider review, as with this strategy review, that looks at key issues and tries to create a better whole for the sport in the future. But at the same time, you can do things with more urgency and actually make changes for the here and now that says, OK, we've got the wide review ongoing, but in the interim, we're doing this because we know something needs to be done.
Yeah, 2 points I'd like to mention, if that's OK. Number one, for me, communication. Tom, you spoke about time frames and this delay. I really think that in order to have trust in the sport and the industry going forward, communication from the BHA side of things needs to be much better, because we just don't hear from racing's leaders all that often. And when we are in such a crisis that could spiral, as you say, we need to have trust in them that something's been done about it. I understand that work is in process, but we need to hear about that work and know what's happening. Another side of things, slightly going to get on my soapbox here and take a different stance, is not last weekend, the weekend before, I was in Hungary for the Grand Prix, and I'm not a big follower of other sports, really. Horse racing takes up an awful lot of my time, and it is my passion. But just the contrast in experience as a spectator, as a fan, Formula One is booming, and it does still have its problems. I'm not ignorant to that. But horse racing is in a much different position, and you just don't get the feeling that you're listened to as a spectator. In racing it would be a punter, as a fan. Formula One, I had a wonderful time, felt appreciated, felt part of a community, felt listened to. I don't feel that in racing at the moment.
Yeah, a lot of the time the conversation in racing seems to lack that crucial ingredient, which is that the fan or the punter is ultimately the most important person. This is, unfortunately, to some people in racing, it's show business, it's entertainment. The whole game does not exist if people don't bet on it or don't watch it or don't go and see it. How often do we hear punters' representatives being involved? How often do we hear about the customer being referenced? A lot of the conversation around prize money, for example, takes place with very little acknowledgement that prize money is a direct link with the popularity of racing.
Yeah.
And we often hear about proposals to change the fixture list or to improve funding, but very rarely do we actually hear proposals which are rooted in the concept of how do we make racing more popular, more appealing to punters, more appealing to racegoers.
While there's a cost of living crisis going on.
Well, indeed, exactly. And I think racing needs to radically recalibrate its way of thinking around its public appeal, around how it's structured, around who the ultimate goal, the end customer is. The customer must be central to everything.
It must be central to everything. You're right, it absolutely is a sport that is all about entertainment. Trainers will often say that my principal concern is my owner, they're my main customer, and that is absolutely correct. But horse racing wouldn't exist if it was just about trainers and owners. You need to have a paying audience that wants to watch the sport, that wants to bet on the sport. Without those people, the sport is nothing. And when you look at something like poor field sizes, you can surely make a direct correlation between poor field sizes and poor attendances. There are lots of reasons why people aren't going racing at the moment, the cost of living crisis being a clear one. But if you're staging meetings where you have only 30 to 40 runners across an entire card and lots of 3 or 4 runner races, why would the customer want to go to those races?
Well, and this is where I think the conversation comes back to the fixture list. And William Haggis made a bit of a splash at the weekend by saying, forget cutting 300 races, cut 300 fixtures. And lots of people sort of seem to agree with that. I think what needs to be remembered is that the correlation between the number of fixtures and racing's income is actually pretty well established. I've seen the raw data. If you have one day with three meetings and another day with 6 meetings, you see a significantly lower turnover on the former. Now, the fixture list in terms of size is actually probably pretty close to the sweet spot. And I know some people think there's far too much racing, but in terms of maximising the return to racing, it's probably quite near where it should be. Now, there's two problems with it. The first is that there's not enough horses to actually fill those fixtures. So actually, even though there's probably the right number of fixtures for consumer interest, there's not enough horses to make those fixtures engaging. And the second, of course, is prize money, which is causing a general weakness across the entirety of racing. So what I think we should be doing with the fixture list is we should be looking at that on a yearly basis and being, quite frankly, ruthless. Underperforming meetings should be culled. The race courses that stage them should not be able to stage poor meetings year after year after year. And at the other end of the spectrum, we should be embracing innovative ideas. We should be embracing the radical and thinking what might expand racing, what might improve its appeal. Do that, try. If it doesn't work, do something different, identify what does work, do more of that, and cull the underperforming fixtures. That's what we ought to be doing. It's not about having loads fewer fixtures, but it is about having better performing fixtures.
And Tom, by talking about radical problems and radical solutions to those problems, you bring us seamlessly to story 2. Right now then, back to Cheltenham, where James Stevens is chomping at the bit to talk. James, the Racing League returned last week. Are you a fan or are you ambivalent?
I wouldn't say I was the biggest fan myself, but I can respect that what's gone into the sport and what's come into racing is a good thing. You know, we've got a lot more prize money, we've got TV, we've got something different. You know, we talk a lot about racing and about what the problems we have with field sizes and stuff. So a bit of initiative is no bad thing. From a personal perspective, I'm not quite sure the Racing League does it for me. I know, Lee, you spoke in your column about the Sugar Cup and how having international riders was a really good thing. And you know, I suppose the two are quite similar. I think racing is a great sport for what it is. I like the idea of a race being a trial to other big races. I like the idea of teams being stable. So I suppose that sort of works for me. I think it was an improvement from last year. You know, the idea of regions and such is quite easy to sort of understand and get behind. I look at it and think there's always room to develop it. You know, they've talked a lot about how they want the Racing League to bring in a new audience. Perhaps we could look at our team captains and bring in sort of people outside racing as a way to get new people in. But it's a step forward. There's a lot of money going into the sport from this. So, look, it's something to give it time. Initially, it's not for me, but I'll be happily won over if it's worth it.
Yeah, I would take the same view, I think, really. I said in a column today that I go to a lot of shows. I'm a big theatre fan, but I wouldn't want to go and see every show that's on in the West End. That doesn't mean I want them to fail. And similarly, the Racing League doesn't really float my boat. But if it can bring in loads of new fans to the sport, I think that would be great. But Tom, you were talking about wanting radical changes earlier on. Is this the sort of radical change you want? And is it the sort of radical change you think can succeed?
Listen, I think it's worth trying.
Yeah.
And clearly the changes they've made for the second year, abandoning those kind of embarrassing corporate team names.
Team Swish.
Team Swish, you know, cocktail firms and so forth that you never heard of. You know, that was clearly not resonating. So going to a regional format, you know, yes, it's much better. I would love to see it succeed. I would love to see it become a big event. I think having ITV televised racing on a weeknight is a brilliant move. Have they got the format right yet? I'm not convinced. Two reasons. First of all, I think for anything like this to work, you need to throw the kitchen sink at it in terms of promotion. And there was no promotion, basically. There were no publicity shots. You didn't have, you know, the team captains. You could have had Matt Chapman and Kevin Blake at sort of like a weigh-in event, basically.
Face off.
Yeah, exactly. You know, listen, some people think that's completely ridiculous, but actually at the same time it draws a bit of attention. But there was basically no promotion. So they've thrown all this money at prize money, but they forgot the PR budget. And I think any event like this needs that. But the second thing that an event like this needs is it needs to have some sense of peril, you know? Like there needs to be consequences. You know, you support you know, Europe at the Ryder Cup over America because you feel some sort of identity there. The significance of the event is obvious. I don't think they've managed to create that yet. I think putting them as regional teams is a smart move, but I don't feel any investment in it because I don't think the stakes exist. You know,
No.
I don't think the teams really care. I don't think there's any real pride at stake.
Tom Marquand riding for Team Ireland.
Indeed. You know, and listen, you know, Matt Chapman, you know, the perfect person to have involved in this because he'll give it everything. You know, Kevin Blake as well. You can see a bit of rivalry developing there, but they're going to have to do a hell of a lot more of all of that in order to make people care. I think if they do that, and it's going to be an uphill struggle, but if they do that and they get people buying into it, could be a big success. But we'll see.
You like it?
Not for me.
No.
I hate to you know, sort of be downbeat, but like you guys, I want it to succeed. I think one of the key parts of this is the members of the racing industry, whether it's jockeys, trainers, etc. They have to really buy into it, and we have to believe their contribution. It has to be genuine, and I'm, to be honest, quite buoyed by the way that people have engaged with it. I think that's important, and it'd be great to see that across the sport, regardless of the racing league. But I'm willing to give it time. I think it needs time. I agree with what Tom and James have said. It's just not for me.
We should say though as well, in the wider sense, that we're talking a lot about field sizes, and I made the point in the intro. You look at these racing league races; they're in effect 0 to 90 handicaps. Newmarket staged 7 Class 2 and 3 handicaps over the weekend, Friday and Saturday. None of them got more than 6 runners. A lot of them got 3 and 4 runners. Now you can make a very clear argument to say that the racing league, in that sense, and you could say as well the Sunday series, are impacting on pre-existing races. Now, is that good for the sport?
Well, surely that's just, you know, we should be accounting for that when we're putting together the fixture list and the programme book. You know, it's not rocket science. You don't need a PhD to figure out. Maybe if we're tabling a whole bunch of good handicaps, we should remove some handicaps from elsewhere. But it's just this idea you can just throw whatever you want in and there'll be no consequences. Well, clearly that's completely nonsensical thinking, and nobody should be surprised about what's happening now at all in terms of field sizes and the impact the Sunday Series and Racing League is having on field sizes.
And again, perhaps what that does tell us is that there might well be merit in this Savile plan idea that others have voiced in the past as well, that the BHA needs to have more central control over all these decisions. 2 stories down, 2 to go, and Maddy Playle, you want to talk about Silvestre De Sousa?
I do, yes. 3-time champion jockey is leaving the UK for Hong Kong. He had 91 winners in his 4 previous stints out there. I've been out there when he's been out there in the past, and he has always seemed very like he's enjoyed the experience. Of course, he lost his big retainer with King Power, and that was a big push for him to make this move. He said if you don't have a retainer, you're going around every day just for 1 or 2 rides, you need to be established with an established stable, and I'm not at the moment. Well, the pluses of Hong Kong are quite clear. You race twice a week. The prize money is lucrative. It is very unforgiving. It is competitive in terms of getting rides. But Silvestre's proved he could do it out there in the past. He clearly has a lot of well-established connections already. He's won group races in Hong Kong already. We've seen Harry Bentley, who was by no means a back number in Britain, make the move. Neil Callan's made the move back after a hugely successful stint of his career, and he's enjoyed connections with Marco Botti and a wide range of trainers. But for whatever reason, Silvestre just doesn't have those at the moment. I think the wider picture with this is that we could see the death of the smaller trainer, owner, journeyman jockey as a result of the problems that we spoke about earlier on. And we're seeing a sport that's increasingly becoming more monopolised. Joe Tweet, who is giving up his training licence, we've seen more and more trainers come forward and said that they can't make it pay. A lot of jockeys are being squeezed as well because obviously riders are retained more by owners and trainers, and there are fewer horses to go around. John Berry, Newmarket trainer and former mayor, he made a statement about this midweek about the sort of death of the smaller trainer and horses going to fewer hands. I'm not saying racing again is immune from this trend of sort of strength in a certain area, but I think it would be a great shame if we lose riders, we lose trainers because racing has become this sort of bigger machine, and we lose that sense of community and having connections with smaller owners and trainers is is really what the sport is all about for a lot of people. So I think it's sad that Silvestre is lost from these shores. You know, as a multiple champion jockey, his talents are known, and in a way it just represents the bigger picture and how racing in this country is struggling. We should want to retain riders like Silvestre. I can see why he's made the decision to leave. I wish him all the best, but I do think this could be just another small alarm bell ringing in the back of people's minds that there's now an outsourcing of talent, not just in terms of horses and trainers, but jockeys too. James, what do you think?
Yeah, I think there's two things here. I mean, I know on the show earlier in the series we discussed the idea when Frankie Dettori and Gosden had the sabbatical, which feels a long time ago now, but that we don't really have contracts for jockeys. It's sort of a gentleman's agreement sort of thing. And I think this is an example of a man who is champion jockey, and to be champion jockey in the modern game, you need loads of those different relationships. And it's funny how it sort of worked over time, that it just quite hasn't worked out for him, and he's made the decision to leave. You know, I think that's an example of how that's perhaps something that we take for granted in racing. And I think secondly, it does address the problems that we've got in the sport. I know earlier we discussed the idea for action. We've talked about trainers leaving, we've talked about jockeys leaving. I think there's an important thing that's sort of been missed on this, is that what staffing is going to be like. You know, there's enough pressure on staffing as it is. And if we're saying about British racing that there's not going to be action until 2024, if you're a parent of someone who might want to work in the industry, what would you say to your children? Do you want to work in an industry where you're not sure there's going to be enough prize money, you're not sure there's not going to be enough horses, and you don't know what the future is? So there's a lot of different problems in racing, as we all well know. We want to retain people, and I think every time that someone leaves, it's another example that this action is needed. Silvestre's a great jockey, and look, I've enjoyed watching him win from the front many a time. So I'll miss him, but I'm sure he'll do brilliantly in Hong Kong as he has done before.
Tom, if Silvestre De Sousa, a triple champion jockey, says there's not really a place for him at the top table of British racing anymore, is that a reflection of Silvestre De Sousa as a character, as a person, as a jockey, or does it paint a wider picture of how British racing is at the moment?
Can I give you a massive cop-out and say it's a bit of both?
Yeah.
Clearly it is reflective of some of the issues going around British racing right now, but at the same time Silvestre De Sousa has also always been a bit anomalous in a sense. You know, he's that sort of like top jockey who wouldn't be riding a Royal Ascot every day, for example. Yeah. You know, the comparison I guess with jumps is Brian Hughes. You know, sometimes you do get very successful, numerically very successful jockeys who for whatever reason just don't become popular in those top tier races, either because they don't have a retainer or it's something about their connections or their riding style. You know, I don't know, like James, I think Silvestre is a great jockey. Clearly he's done very well in Hong Kong when he's gone out there, and he has been in demand. So it's not surprising to see that he's opted to base himself there for the foreseeable. Yeah,
I've always thought Silvestre De Sousa a great jockey. Always thought as well he's slightly an outsider, but doing our job, he's great in many ways. I was at Goodwood for the glorious meeting there, and on the Friday he was jocked off his horse in the Golden Mile because a stable companion was a non-runner, and he was actually prepared to say, no, I'm really angry at this. This is bad. Not many people would do that. Yeah. For people like us, Silvestre De Sousa is good copy, and I'm sure that the Hong Kong racing media will think so too, and we wish him well over there. Okay, right, finishing off with my story, and I hold my hand up here because I'm in some ways a player in this story. We'll have been reading in the Racing Post in recent weeks through people like Gordon Elliott, Horse Racing Ireland, and again today with Johnny Levins, that Irish trainers are very angry, or some Irish trainers are very angry, and as is Horse Racing Ireland, that at the moment and for the foreseeable future, Irish trained horses will not be allowed to run in the lowest grades of British races, so Class 5 and 6 on the flat, handicaps and classified races, and Class 5 races over jumps. Obviously, in all jurisdictions, rules came in during COVID that said we're going to keep these to purely domestic affairs, but then as those rules eased off, British Racing decided in September 2020 to impose this ban on overseas trained horses. That ban has been maintained at two stages by the racing group, a cross-industry body in which I'm involved, and the view was taken that for pragmatic reasons that have been outlined by the BHA in recent days, one that in terms of field sizes, it's actually those low-grade races is where generally we haven't got a problem. They tend to produce competitive races, although you're always going to have periods, particularly in the summer, where that's not the case. Within those low-grade races, we have a lot of elimination so that British owners and trainers can't get their horses into races. And within those low-grade races, overseas trained horses, Irish trained horses, tend to be harder to handicap accurately and have a much, much bigger success rate than even you would think of a horse that's coming from a different jurisdiction to race over here. You'd imagine that would have a bigger impact value, but they have a much bigger impact value, bigger strike rate. So we've opted to maintain the policy, but I think there's also a principled reason behind it, in that I take the view that whilst we all want the best horses racing from all around the world in the best races, and we're all aware of the potential to be accused of protectionism, I do think you can argue that at grassroots level, a governing body's primary concern and consideration should be to protect and look after those people who domestically compete at that grassroots level. And that if Irish owners and trainers at the minute are struggling to get into Irish races, that's an Irish problem that Ireland needs to be looking at. And I would also point out that I think has been often lost in the debate, that Irish racing has historically had the same rule. If you look in Irish flat races, they do not allow overseas trained horses to run if they're rated less than 60. So Irish racing in some way sets the precedent for the rule that Britain now has. It's not ideal. In an ideal world, you'd have everyone from everywhere racing in every race. But I think on this rule, it's merited. Am I completely wrong?
Is there not a way that we could address the legitimate concerns that you raised there while not turning our nose up at much needed runners? And I take the point which you and the BHA made, that these class of races actually have some pretty healthy field sizes, but equally we've all seen some pretty desperate summer jump field sizes recently, and up at Perth in particular, Gordon Elliott's been complaining about being excluded from half the races on the card when these races have 4 or 5 runner fields. So 2 things to potentially address it. First of all, some sort of handicapping mechanism to rebalance the playing field. We had a cross-the-board £5 mentioned in the paper today. Second, would it be possible to simply say Irish horses get balloted out first?
That would be an option. Yeah, that would be something that could be looked at. I think there is also a wider concern too, in that you hear rumours and whispers on racecourses, and there are suggestions that there might be some Irish trainers who are getting horses handicapped in Ireland and then moving them to British yards, and therefore they race out of a British stable in British races, when in effect they are still trained in Ireland. Now, obviously there's no proof of that, but little dicky birds say things, and sometimes little dicky birds...
Skullduggery and handicaps.
You wouldn't believe it, would you?
I am appalled.
Are you appalled as well, Maddy?
Look, I take your point about British racing having to support its own grassroots, but as a fan of sort of competition and keeping these races healthy, I wouldn't say I necessarily agree with banning Irish trained runners. I do agree with Tom in that there needs to be some moderation involved, but yeah, I'm afraid I do disagree that I think it's okay that to me that doesn't sit right, that there isn't the freedom to see these horses, if they are the best, in those races, and I just think that's we should be calling for the best in terms of competition, and a free market almost. I think that would make racing a lot stronger. But I do think we need to do more to determine these horses are treated fairly within the system.
James, they both tell me I'm completely wrong. That's 2 against me. What do you think, James?
I'm actually with you, Lee. You'll be glad to know.
James.
I understand. I understand the sort of points about this, and I think that the key for me is that not necessarily Irish are coming over and winning those low-grade races, but it's the fact that British runners aren't getting a run in there. And I think that's obviously dangerous. We talked a bit about the grassroots sports, the pressure on it. It's important that we prioritise those at this point in time. We talked about British racing being in a bit of an unhealthy position, and particularly those at the bottom. The strains are going to be felt a lot more. I think we just need to be wary of that. And at this point in time, I think this is the right thing to do. As you say, the field sizes stack up fairly well. The 0 to 100s, even over jumps in the summer, has been pretty decent. So, yeah, I think at the moment it's the right thing to do. But look, over time, it's definitely something to readdress.
James, you speak very good sense. OK, 4 stories covered then in this week's edition of The Front Page, and all very good stories. All of them, I think, will be legitimate contenders to be our front page story. Maddy Silvestre De Sousa is clearly one of our highest profile jockeys, and if he's deciding to join this exodus of talent from Britain, that has to be a real concern. I thought my story was clearly a very, very good story about this diplomatic furore between Britain and Ireland, but maybe not the winning story. And James, you know, the Racing League is back, and it's clearly a huge development in British racing, but I think we can maybe better judge it at the end of this year's series in terms of how well it's done in year 2. So Tom, and not just because you're the editor and you hold all our futures in your hands, but I think you do have the biggest story this week in that it does involve the entire sport over here and the sport's future, and there's a real urgency that something has to be done at the moment. Not a great deal is being done in terms of hard changes. We wait to see what will happen. So Tom, you have the winning front page story. Congratulations.
Thank you very much.
Congratulations to you all for watching. Thank you for all of you for taking part in the show this week. We're back again next week when Tom will be in this chair, and I'm sure he will be looking forward to talking to you all then. Until then, goodbye.